So the idea of arrays is actually really straightforward. It's a data structure which allows you to store more than one value. But how we use them and what we use them for and how they kind of like are implemented inside programs is much more challenging. So in this lesson, we're just going to be looking at how we can access individual items out of an array. Then we're going to start moving through into how to loop through them, how to change values with them, and ultimately how to problem solve using arrays. Okay, so let's get started then. So this is a slight aside before we get into arrays, but just a reminder that a variable will store one value normally. Okay, so here we've got two variables, test score 1 and 2. They're storing two values, and when we create a variable, they are stored somewhere in RAM. Now, in this example, I've got RAM at the bottom here, and those two numbers, 13 and 6, are placed somewhere in RAM. Now, the location of those values is it's not random, but we have no control over it. Okay, so those locations, or memory addresses is what they're really called, is assigned by the operating system, is assigned by the Python interpreter. We have very little control over that. So creating all these variables, it might be that those variables are stored sequentially in RAM. It might be a bit more random. Again, we have no control over it. It's all assigned by the operating system and the memory manager inside the operating system. So we're going to do a little experiment to see where variables are being placed in memory. So here I've got 3 variables. And I'm going to print out where they are located, the address. Okay, so when you create a variable, it's going to be placed in RAM somewhere. The location of where it's stored, so we'll say exactly where in RAM it is called its memory address. And that's just going to be an integer number. Okay, these integers range from 0 up to however much RAM you've got. So I'm printing out the variable, comma, just the string literal address. So it's going to say the word address. And then it's going to use this special function called ID. What ID does is find the memory address of whatever variable is inside its parameters. So if I run that program, you can see it says 1 has the address of that. Okay, so I can do that for the other 2 variables and run it again. Okay, and as you can see, it has given me 3 different memory addresses. Now they are very close together, but they're not necessarily right next to each other. Okay, it is going to be slightly random where these variables get placed. So if I create a 4th one, so var4 equals maybe 90. So I'll give it a complete different value, and then print that one out as well. Then run it again. You can see I get a very different number for that one. So these are being placed at the kind of whims of the operating system, memory manager, and the Python interpreter. So you have absolutely no control of where these variables go. But actually, normally you don't care about that. But what we do care about is that these are being placed in RAM somewhere, and that they're not necessarily going to be next to each other. That becomes important when we start wanting to loop over variables, which we're going to start to look at in a later lesson. So imagine I want to add up all those test scores. The code you can see on the screen at the moment will do so. Okay, so it's doing test score +1, then 2, then 3. Now I couldn't fit it all on the screen at once, but you can work out the rest of the line of code. It will go test scores +5, +6, and so forth. Now this is not very flexible at all, because obviously if we start to add more test scores, we are going to have to add more to that line of code. What if those are hundreds of test scores? Okay, we're going to have to add on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those on there. That line of code is going to be going unmanageable. And do I want to have to change that code every time I add a new test score? That doesn't seem a very flexible or efficient way of doing things. So arrays become the solution to that inefficiency. So if I want to add up a load of values, I can place those into an array and then I can loop over them. So we're going to take some steps through to actually get to that point where we can actually loop over it and do some problem solving with arrays. But let's actually see how it's structured. Now here I've got an array called test scores, plural. Okay, and notice that I've put some square brackets here and here. Okay, so whenever we are accessing values in an array, we'll use square brackets. That's very common in most programming languages. The only one I can think of which doesn't use square brackets is Visual Basic, but the least said about that, the better. Then let's see how these match up. So the first test score here is the first value in my array. The second one is the second, okay, and so on and so forth. Now, one little aside before we move on is, now, although I'm talking about arrays and I'm saying this is array, it's not technically an array, it's actually technically a list. Python uses lists and not arrays. Now, you might be asking, well, what's the difference? There are some fundamental differences. We can treat lists like arrays, which is exactly what we're going to do for these videos. And the reason for that is because that's how the GCSE will work. The GCSE only talks about arrays, so there's no point talking about lists because we are interested in arrays. This is just the easiest way to get ready for the GCSE. However, we'll make a video to explain the differences and what you can do with lists that you can't do with arrays. Essentially, arrays aren't as flexible as lists are, as I said before, we need to learn arrays, not lists. So we're going to pretend that Python lists are actually truly arrays. Okay, so that's what we are going to do. So how do I get a value out of an array? Now, because I've got a single variable which is storing multiple values now, I need a bit more information if I want to access just one of them. Okay, so if I want to access a single value in the array, so for example, let's say I want to get this 87 out, okay, I need to know where in the array it is. And that location is called an index. Okay, so we call it index and not an address, just to make it very different to memory addressing. So we start our indices at 0. Okay, so it's 0 indexed. So the 87 is at index 4, which means it's the 5th value. Okay, so the first item in the array will have an index of 0, the second will have an index of 1, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this array has 10 values, so the last index is always 1 less than that. Okay, that takes a little bit of getting used to and a little bit of thinking about, because we're not necessarily used to that kind of thing. But if you remember that the first value is always 0 and then count up, then you shouldn't go too far wrong. So let's look at the code to access some of these values. Now, in order to do this, so this array is called test scores, by the way. So you need to supply the name of the array first. Okay, that's important. You then have to use these square brackets. Okay, so that becomes our way of accessing values inside an arrays and how we use arrays. So you're going to get very used to that, hopefully. And then we have to supply the index. Now, the index is always going to be an integer value. Okay, so in this example, we got the index of 2, which is referring to this 95, which is why you were getting the number 95 there. Here we've got an index of 5, which is this one over here, which is why we're getting the value of 54. So that's how we can start to access individual items within an array. Okay, so here's an array with 4 values inside it. Okay, I'm aware this is technically a list, but we're going to pretend it's an array nevertheless. So if I do this, if I go print A, what's going to happen is it's going to print out all the values. Okay, now if I just want one of those values, I need to do things slightly differently. So if I run this code now, you can see it says 76. But why does it say 76? Well, let's have a look. I've got the name of my array here, which is called A. Then I use these special square brackets, which allow me to access just one item from the list. Okay, it then says 2. Now, if you look at the second element, well, that's 3. So why does it print out 76? The reason for that is because it's known as a 0 index. So the first item in the list is actually position 0. So that's 0, then 1, and then 2. So that's the reason we're getting 76. If I do print A0, run that, you can see it gives me the value of 8. If I do 3, I'm going to get the 90. So what happens if I put 4 in then? Now, as you can see, there isn't a fourth index, it's not a fifth value. So if I run that code, I get this error saying list index out of range. It's a very, very, very common error in Python. What it means is you're trying to access an index that doesn't actually exist. Okay, so your array is too small. Okay, you're trying to access something outside the array. I can, for example, use a variable for this. So I could have a variable p, put a number inside it, and replace that with p. If I run that, see I get 90. Well, p has the value of 3, 0, 1, 2, 3. There's my 90. I can also do a little calculation as well. I could do p minus 1. So what's going to happen is it's going to do this calculation first, and then it's going to use that as an index. So p is 3, 3 minus 1 is 2, and it's going to use 2 as the index, and then it's going to print out the value 2. So let's have a look. So it gives me 76, 0, 1, 2. It's giving me the second index. If I print p out as well, just as a side point, you can see p is 3 still because I've not assigned a new value to p. Okay, so although I have taken a 1 away from p, it's not permanently changed it. Okay, so that allows us to manipulate arrays, and this using an index as a variable becomes very useful when we start using loops with arrays. So here's a little practice task. Now, what I want you to do is to create an array, and maybe you want to call this array names or something like that. And I want you to store 3 names in it. It doesn't really matter what those names are. Then I want you to say hello to each of them, okay, using the array and the indexes, okay. So for example, it should look something similar to this. You must be using those square brackets, you must be supplied an index. So it might be something like names 0, names 1, names 2, okay. So it should say hello Bert, hello Sally, whatever happens to be, okay. So pause the video, have a go at that. If you get absolutely stuck or just want to check your answer, the model answer is on the next part. Okay, so here's the model answer. Now, either one or two things have happened. Either that task, you found that task really difficult because you're not really sure what was being asked. That sometimes happens. Or you found that a doddle. Okay. Hopefully now looking at the solution, you can see how straightforward this really was. So we wanted to say hello to the 3 people in the array. So here we've got 3 names, Bert, Zubair and Sally. Notice they are in quotation marks because they're strings. Remember, all strings will come in quotation mark. If you didn't put quotation marks in there, Python would think they're variables and you'd get some weird errors. So we have those names. Notice the commas in between them. Okay, that's how we separate them out. And notice the square brackets, which allow us to define the array. Then I want to say hello to each of them. So I'm just putting the word hello, the string hello, comma, and then the name of the array, and then the index I want to say. So this one will say hello, name 0, well position 0, index 0 will be Bert. The names 1 would be Zubair, and names 2 will be Sally. Okay, so that's how you'd write the solution to that problem.